Listen carefully, ICC. I just ripped 3 West African nations from your rotting grip. You thought 54 nations would stay your prisoners forever. You believed your white judges would keep hunting Africans while every Western butcher who massacred our children walked free. I chose war against your system. This is your last breath of warning. Stop using justice to slaughter African sovereignty, or I'll lead all 54 nations out and collapse your funding into dust. Touch one more African leader, and I'll make your institution a memory. We sharpen our own blades now. Let me explain exactly how I discovered that the ICC had become a tool for prosecuting African leaders while systematically ignoring crimes committed by Western powers and their allies. This wasn't about rejecting international justice. This was about refusing to accept a system that applied law selectively based on who held power rather than who committed crimes. I was reviewing ICC prosecution patterns over its entire history when something caught my attention that demanded serious examination and response. Since its establishment in 2002, the International Criminal Court had opened investigations in numerous situations involving alleged crimes against humanity and war crimes. But the geographic and political distribution of these investigations revealed a pattern that was impossible to ignore or justify as coincidental. The ICC had opened formal investigations into situations in Uganda, Democratic Republic of Congo, Central African Republic, Sudan, Kenya, Libya, Côte d'Ivoire, Mali, and several other African countries. The court had issued arrest warrants for African leaders, including sitting heads of state. Prosecutors had pursued cases against African military commanders, rebel leaders, and government officials with aggressive determination. African situations dominated the ICC's docket completely, representing the overwhelming majority of its investigative and prosecutorial activities. But during the same period, the ICC had failed to open investigations into numerous situations involving alleged crimes by Western powers and their allies, despite extensive documentation and calls from civil society organizations. American military actions in Iraq and Afghanistan that killed hundreds of thousands of civilians were never investigated despite clear evidence of potential war crimes. British involvement in these same conflicts received no ICC scrutiny. French military operations in Africa that resulted in civilian deaths were ignored. Israeli actions in occupied Palestinian territories that human rights organizations documented extensively never led to meaningful ICC prosecution. The pattern was undeniable and revealed fundamental bias in how international justice was applied. When African leaders were accused of crimes, the ICC moved aggressively with investigations, arrest warrants, and trials. When Western powers or their allies were accused of comparable or worse crimes, the ICC found reasons not to investigate or pursued only symbolic gestures that led nowhere. The court claimed to represent universal justice, but its actions demonstrated it primarily prosecuted the weak while protecting the powerful. I calculated the numbers precisely to document this bias objectively. Of all situations under ICC investigation since its establishment, approximately 85% involved African countries. Of all individuals indicted by the ICC, over 90% were African. Of all trials conducted, virtually 100% involved African defendants. Meanwhile, 0 Western political or military leaders had faced ICC prosecution despite numerous documented situations that arguably met the court's jurisdiction criteria. This selective application of international justice was not accidental but reflected the power dynamics underlying the ICC's structure and operation. The court was created and funded primarily by Western countries that maintained significant influence over its operations through various mechanisms. American pressure, though the United States refused to join the ICC itself, shaped court decisions about what situations to investigate. European countries that provided majority funding influenced prosecutorial priorities. The court's location in The Hague placed it firmly within Western institutional and political context. The result was a system of international justice that reinforced rather than challenged existing power hierarchies. African leaders could be prosecuted for crimes against their own populations or neighboring countries. But Western leaders who ordered military operations that killed civilians in multiple countries faced no accountability through ICC mechanisms. The court became a tool for maintaining Western dominance rather than an institution genuinely serving universal justice principles. I also discovered that ICC investigations in Africa often served political purposes aligned with Western interests rather than purely pursuing justice. Several investigations were opened at moments when they would undermine African leaders who challenged Western policies or who pursued independent foreign policies. The timing and targets of investigations suggested coordination with Western political objectives rather than neutral application of legal standards. The ICC investigation of Sudanese President Omar al-Bashir intensified when Sudan was resisting Western pressure on various issues. The Kenya investigation targeted leaders who had pursued closer relationships with China and advocated for African independence from Western influence. The Libya investigation provided legal justification for NATO military intervention that overthrew the government. The pattern suggested the ICC was being used strategically to weaken African leaders who didn't comply with Western preferences. This politicization of international justice was profoundly problematic and undermined the entire legitimacy of the court. If the ICC could be used selectively to prosecute Western adversaries while ignoring comparable crimes by Western allies, it wasn't truly a court of justice but a political weapon disguised as legal institution. African countries participating in such a system were complicit in our own subjugation through legal mechanisms that masqueraded as neutral justice. I began consultations with leaders of Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso about whether our countries should continue participation in the ICC given this systematic bias. These three countries formed a close alliance pursuing independent policies and resisting Western interference in our internal affairs. We had all experienced Western pressure through various mechanisms and recognized patterns of how international institutions were weaponized against countries that challenged Western dominance. The discussions revealed shared frustrations with the ICC and recognition that the court had lost legitimacy in African eyes through its selective prosecution patterns. We agreed that continuing ICC membership meant accepting a system that would potentially be used against us if we pursued policies Western powers opposed, while knowing that Western crimes would never face the same scrutiny. The asymmetry was intolerable for countries seeking genuine sovereignty. We identified specific concerns that made ICC membership problematic for our countries. The court could investigate our military operations against armed groups without examining how Western interference had created the instability we were fighting. The court could prosecute our leaders for decisions made during conflicts without acknowledging that Western powers had fueled these conflicts through weapons supplies to various factions. The court could hold us accountable for civilian casualties in our territories while ignoring far larger civilian death tolls from Western military interventions across multiple countries. The Rome Statute that created the ICC included provisions for countries to withdraw from the court's jurisdiction. Article 127 specified that states could withdraw by written notification to the UN Secretary-General, with withdrawal taking effect 1 year after notification. Several African countries had previously withdrawn individually, but coordinated withdrawal by multiple countries simultaneously would send a much stronger political message about African rejection of the ICC's selective justice. I proposed that Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso announce coordinated withdrawal from the ICC in a joint statement that explicitly outlined our reasons related to systematic bias against Africa and protection of Western crimes. The coordinated action would demonstrate this wasn't just individual country decisions but reflected broader African concerns about how international justice institutions operated. It would create momentum for other African countries to reconsider their ICC membership. The leaders of Mali and Niger agreed that coordinated withdrawal made sense both practically and symbolically. We spent several weeks drafting a joint statement that would explain our decision in terms that challenged the ICC's legitimacy directly rather than offering diplomatic euphemisms. We wanted to be explicit that we were leaving because the court had become a tool for Western political objectives rather than genuinely serving universal justice. The joint statement we drafted emphasized several key points. First, we documented the statistical reality that the ICC had overwhelmingly targeted African situations and individuals while systematically avoiding investigation of Western crimes despite extensive evidence. Second, we highlighted specific situations where the ICC had failed to act on Western crimes that clearly met the court's jurisdiction criteria. Third, we argued that this selective application of justice undermined the court's legitimacy and made it a political weapon rather than genuine legal institution. Fourth, we affirmed our commitment to justice but stated we would pursue accountability through African mechanisms rather than biased international courts. We scheduled a joint press conference in Ouagadougou for announcing our coordinated withdrawal from the ICC. We invited international media to ensure maximum visibility for our decision and the reasoning behind it. We wanted the withdrawal to spark broader debate about ICC bias and encourage other African countries to reconsider their participation in a system that systematically targeted our continent while protecting others. The press conference in late 2025 drew significant international attention. Representatives from over 60 countries' media organizations attended to hear our announcement. I spoke first, explaining Burkina Faso's decision to withdraw from the ICC and outlining the pattern of selective prosecution that had destroyed the court's legitimacy in African eyes. The presidents of Mali and Niger followed with their own statements emphasizing shared concerns and commitment to coordinated action. We released the detailed joint statement documenting ICC bias with specific statistics and examples. We challenged the court to explain why it had never prosecuted Western leaders despite extensive evidence of crimes falling under its jurisdiction. We announced that our withdrawals would take effect in 1 year as the Rome Statute required. And we called on other African countries to join us in rejecting a system of international justice that applied different standards based on power rather than law. The reaction was immediate and intense. ICC officials condemned our decision as undermining international justice and encouraging impunity. They claimed the court investigated situations based on evidence and legal criteria rather than political considerations. They suggested our withdrawal reflected fear of accountability rather than legitimate concerns about bias. They warned that leaving the ICC would isolate our countries internationally and damage our reputations. Western governments that funded and supported the ICC expressed disappointment and concern. They argued the court represented progress toward universal justice and that African countries should work to improve it from within rather than abandoning it entirely. They suggested our withdrawal was politically motivated and designed to shield ourselves from potential future prosecution. They warned of consequences for our relationships with countries that supported the ICC strongly. But I noticed that none of these responses actually addressed the substance of our criticisms about selective prosecution patterns. ICC officials and Western governments focused entirely on defending the court's legitimacy in abstract terms while avoiding specific questions about why the court had never prosecuted Western leaders despite documented evidence of crimes. The evasion confirmed that they had no legitimate answer to our core argument about systematic bias. I responded to ICC criticism by publicly challenging the court to name a single Western political or military leader it had prosecuted for crimes despite decades of documented military operations that killed hundreds of thousands of civilians. I asked why American drone strikes that killed civilians in multiple countries had never led to ICC investigation when similar actions by African military forces triggered immediate ICC response. I demanded explanation for why Israeli actions in occupied territories documented by human rights organizations for decades had never resulted in meaningful ICC prosecution. The ICC had no satisfactory answers to these questions because the answers would require admitting that the court applied different standards based on political power. Western crimes were ignored because Western countries influenced the court's operations through funding and political pressure. African crimes were prosecuted because African countries lacked the power to prevent ICC action. The system was fundamentally unjust, precisely because it wasn't truly universal, but selectively applied based on power dynamics. Listen carefully. ICC and every Western government that weaponized justice against Africa while protecting your own criminals. Remember when you thought African countries would accept permanent subjugation to biased courts? Remember when you believed we'd never coordinate action against your selective justice? Remember when you assumed international law meant African accountability without Western consequences? I shattered every assumption. I organized 3 nations to withdraw simultaneously. I exposed your hypocrisy with undeniable statistics. I chose African sovereignty over your manipulated system. Your authority over West Africa ended. Your credibility collapsed. Africa judges itself now. The coordinated withdrawal announcement sparked intense debate across Africa about ICC membership and whether other countries should follow our lead. Civil society organizations, legal scholars, politicians, and ordinary citizens engaged in vigorous discussions about the value of ICC participation versus the problems of systematic bias. The conversation we had sparked was exactly what we had hoped to achieve. Many African voices supported our decision and echoed concerns about ICC selective prosecution. Legal scholars pointed to academic studies documenting the court's disproportionate focus on African situations. Civil society activists highlighted specific cases where the ICC had failed to investigate Western crimes despite clear evidence. Politicians argued that international institutions needed fundamental reform to serve justice rather than power. Public opinion polling in multiple African countries showed majority support for the position that the ICC was biased against Africa. But other African voices criticized our withdrawal and argued we should work to reform the ICC from within rather than abandoning it. Some civil society organizations worried that ICC withdrawal would reduce accountability for crimes committed by African leaders against their own populations. Legal scholars cautioned that rejecting international justice mechanisms could enable impunity. Politicians suggested withdrawal would isolate African countries and damage relationships with Western partners. I engaged directly with these criticisms through extensive public communications. I acknowledged that accountability for crimes was crucial and that African leaders who committed atrocities should face justice. But I argued that accountability needed to be universal and impartial rather than selectively applied based on power. An institution that prosecuted only African crimes while protecting Western crimes wasn't serving justice but perpetuating injustice through legal mechanisms. I also pointed out that ICC membership had not actually prevented crimes in Africa or provided meaningful accountability for victims. The situations the ICC had investigated in African countries often continued for years or decades despite court involvement. Arrest warrants issued for African leaders were often not executed because those leaders maintained power. The lengthy trials conducted by the ICC delivered at best symbolic justice for small numbers of cases while leaving systemic problems unaddressed. The court's actual impact on reducing crimes or providing accountability was questionable even on its own terms. Meanwhile, the absence of ICC accountability for Western crimes meant hundreds of thousands of victims of American, British, French, and Israeli military actions never received any justice at all. The victims of drone strikes, torture programs, illegal invasions, and occupation had no recourse through ICC mechanisms. Their lives and suffering apparently mattered less than African victims because their killers came from powerful countries. This fundamental injustice destroyed any claim the ICC made to universal justice. I propose that African countries should develop continental accountability mechanisms through the African Union that would apply consistent standards to crimes by any actor, regardless of power. We should create African courts with jurisdiction over crimes committed on African soil by any party, including foreign militaries and corporations. We should build systems of justice that we controlled and that would serve African victims rather than external political agendas. This vision of African justice systems that could hold all actors accountable, including Western powers, resonated strongly across the continent. Many African leaders recognized that genuine accountability required institutions we controlled rather than supposedly neutral international bodies that were actually influenced heavily by Western power. The conversation shifted from defending ICC membership to discussing what African alternatives should look like. Several other African countries began seriously discussing ICC withdrawal following our coordinated action. Debates occurred in parliaments and public forums about whether continued membership served national interests. Some countries moved forward with withdrawal notifications to the UN Secretary General. Others implemented legal reviews of their ICC commitments. The momentum we had created was transforming African engagement with international justice institutions. By mid-2026, 5 additional African countries had announced ICC withdrawals, bringing the total to 8 countries that had formally left or initiated withdrawal processes. Another dozen countries were conducting official reviews of ICC membership, with outcomes uncertain but leaning toward withdrawal. The coordinated action by Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso had catalyzed a broader African reconsideration of participation in institutions that systematically disadvantaged our continent. The ICC faced its most serious legitimacy crisis since establishment. If a substantial portion of African countries withdrew, the court would lose jurisdiction over most situations it had historically investigated. The court's claim to universal justice would be completely undermined if an entire continent rejected its authority. The institutional and political consequences would be severe. ICC officials and Western governments that supported the court intensified pressure on African countries to reconsider withdrawal decisions. They offered vague promises about addressing African concerns regarding bias. They suggested working groups to examine court practices and make recommendations for reforms. They emphasized the importance of African participation in international justice. They warned about consequences of isolation from international legal systems. But these responses were too little and too late. African countries had been raising concerns about ICC bias for years without meaningful response. Now that withdrawals were actually happening and threatening the court's viability, suddenly Western powers were interested in dialogue about reforms. The timing revealed that previous inattention to African concerns had been deliberate rather than accidental. The ICC would only consider changes when its institutional survival was threatened. I rejected these last-minute reform promises as inadequate and insincere. Real reform would require fundamental changes to ICC structure and operations, including prosecuting Western leaders for documented crimes, transferring control from Western-dominated institutions to truly representative global governance, and eliminating political influence over prosecutorial decisions. The working groups and dialogue processes being offered would produce only cosmetic changes that wouldn't address systematic bias. I argued that African countries should proceed with withdrawals and focus energy on building continental justice mechanisms rather than wasting time trying to reform institutions designed to maintain Western dominance. We had better options than continuing to participate in systems that would never genuinely serve African interests regardless of minor reforms. The withdrawal process itself revealed additional problems with how the ICC operated. The Rome Statute required 1 year between withdrawal notification and actual exit from jurisdiction. During this year, the court maintained authority to investigate crimes committed by withdrawing states. This provision meant that countries withdrawing couldn't immediately escape ICC jurisdiction, but faced an extended period where the court could still act against them. Several legal scholars and African politicians argued this 1-year waiting period was itself problematic because it created opportunities for political prosecutions of countries that had decided to leave. The ICC could potentially initiate investigations during the withdrawal year as retaliation for the decision to exit. The provision discouraged countries from exercising their legal right to withdraw by maintaining ICC authority even after withdrawal decisions were made. The year between announcement and completion of withdrawal passed with continued public debate about international justice, African sovereignty, and the future of the ICC. The 3 West African countries that had coordinated our withdrawal used this period to develop alternative accountability mechanisms through African institutions. We strengthened cooperation with the African Court on Human and People's Rights. We established regional justice mechanisms for investigating crimes in our territories. We built systems that would provide accountability without dependence on biased international institutions. By late 2026, our formal withdrawals from the ICC took effect. Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso were no longer subject to ICC jurisdiction. The court could not investigate situations in our territories or issue arrest warrants for our nationals. We had recovered a crucial aspect of sovereignty that ICC membership had compromised. We would be accountable to our own citizens and African institutions rather than to a Western-influenced international court that had never genuinely served justice. The successful completion of coordinated withdrawal demonstrated that African countries could exit international institutions that didn't serve our interests despite pressure to remain. The action established precedent that would influence other countries' decisions about ICC membership and participation in various international bodies. We had shown that African sovereignty meant the right to reject systems that systematically disadvantaged our continent. The broader impact extended beyond the ICC, specifically to how African countries approached international institutions generally. We had demonstrated the importance of analyzing whether institutions actually served African interests or primarily benefited others. We had shown that coordinated African action could challenge international systems rather than simply accepting them as unchangeable. We had proven that sovereignty required willingness to exit arrangements that compromised independence. Palestinian observers noted parallels between African experiences with the ICC and Palestinian encounters with international justice mechanisms. Despite extensive documentation of Israeli crimes in occupied territories, the ICC had failed to provide meaningful accountability. Palestinians faced the same selective justice that African countries experienced, prosecution of resistance while protection of occupation. African withdrawal from the ICC thus resonated with Palestinians who had also been failed by international justice institutions. The coordinated withdrawal from the ICC became another example of how African countries were asserting sovereignty and independence from Western-dominated systems in 2025 and beyond. Along with the tire-based road innovation that demonstrated African technological capacity and the Israeli business shutdown that showed African solidarity with Palestine through concrete action, the ICC withdrawal reflected comprehensive African rejection of subordination to external control. These actions combined to signal fundamental transformation in African international engagement. We were no longer willing to accept systems designed to maintain our subordination. We were building alternatives that served African interests. We were coordinating collective action that created power through unity. We were demonstrating that African sovereignty meant more than nominal independence. It required actual control over our decisions, resources, institutions, and futures. I recognize that sustaining African independence from the ICC and other problematic international institutions required continuing to build robust continental alternatives. We couldn't simply reject external systems without creating African mechanisms that would provide the governance, accountability, and justice functions that international institutions claim to serve. Building these alternatives was essential work that would occupy African countries for years. We expanded the jurisdiction and capacity of the African Court on Human and People's Rights to handle situations previously referred to the ICC. We provided increased funding to the court so it could handle more complex cases. We strengthened enforcement mechanisms so court decisions would be implemented rather than ignored. We built African judicial institutions that could provide accountability for crimes committed on our continent. We also established truth and reconciliation processes modeled on successful African examples like South Africa and Rwanda. These mechanisms addressed crimes and conflicts through restorative rather than purely punitive approaches. They emphasized healing communities and preventing future violence rather than only prosecuting individuals. They reflected African traditions of justice that international institutions often ignored. We created regional accountability mechanisms for investigating cross-border crimes and holding actors from any country responsible for actions in our territories. These mechanisms had jurisdiction over foreign militaries and corporations operating in Africa, closing the accountability gap the ICC had created by prosecuting only Africans. When Western military operations caused civilian deaths, African courts could investigate and demand accountability rather than relying on ICC mechanisms that would never act. The regional accountability mechanisms we established represented a fundamental shift in how justice would operate on the African continent. For decades, crimes committed by foreign actors in Africa had gone unpunished because international institutions refused to hold powerful countries accountable. Western military forces could bomb African villages, multinational corporations could poison African water supplies, foreign mercenaries could massacre African civilians, and none of these actors faced meaningful consequences through international justice systems that claimed universal jurisdiction but practiced selective prosecution. We designed our regional mechanisms explicitly to close these accountability gaps and ensure that no actor could commit crimes in Africa with impunity regardless of their nationality or power. The mechanisms operated through three interconnected institutions that provided comprehensive coverage. The West African Justice Tribunal had jurisdiction over serious crimes committed in Mali, Niger, Burkina Faso, and other participating countries. The African Regional Criminal Court handled cases involving multiple countries or situations requiring continental-level investigation. National courts strengthened through African Union support provided frontline accountability in individual countries. The jurisdiction of these African institutions extended explicitly to foreign actors, including military forces, intelligence operatives, corporate entities, and individual foreign nationals who committed crimes on African soil. This was crucial because the ICC had effectively provided immunity to foreign actors by refusing to investigate their crimes while aggressively prosecuting Africans. Our mechanisms would hold everyone accountable equally regardless of nationality or political power. We established clear legal frameworks defining crimes under African jurisdiction that closely matched international law standards but emphasized violations particularly relevant to African contexts. War crimes included deliberate targeting of civilians, use of prohibited weapons, destruction of civilian infrastructure, and attacks on humanitarian personnel. Crimes against humanity covered systematic persecution, forced displacement, torture, and extrajudicial killings. Environmental crimes recognized destruction of ecosystems and pollution that harmed communities. Economic crimes addressed exploitation through corrupt business practices and theft of resources. The inclusion of environmental and economic crimes reflected African recognition that justice needed to address the full range of harms our populations suffered. Western military operations weren't the only foreign crimes requiring accountability. Multinational corporations that destroyed environments to extract resources cheaply were also criminals whose actions devastated African communities. Financial institutions that facilitated corruption and resource theft were accomplices whose crimes demanded prosecution. African justice systems would address comprehensive reality of victimization rather than narrow definitions that excluded economic and environmental destruction. We recruited and trained judges, prosecutors, and investigators who would staff these African accountability mechanisms with competence and integrity that would command international respect and domestic legitimacy. We established rigorous selection processes that prioritized legal expertise, unwavering commitment to impartial justice, and deep understanding of African contexts that international institutions consistently lacked. We provided extensive, comprehensive training in international humanitarian law, advanced investigative techniques, witness protection protocols, and victim support methodologies. We built professional capacity within African institutions that would rival or exceed what the ICC had developed over 2 decades with billions in Western funding. The recruitment process for African justice personnel began with continent-wide search for the most qualified legal professionals willing to serve continental accountability mechanisms. We advertised positions through African legal associations, university law faculties, national judicial systems, and civil society organizations working on justice issues. We received over 3,000 applications for 200 initial positions, including judges, prosecutors, investigators, and support staff. The overwhelming response demonstrated that Africa possessed abundant legal talent eager to serve continental justice institutions. Selection committees comprised respected African legal scholars, retired judges with impeccable reputations, and civil society representatives examined applications thoroughly. They evaluated candidates based on legal qualifications, including advanced degrees, years of relevant experience, and demonstrated expertise in criminal law and human rights. They assessed commitment to impartial justice through references, published writings, and extensive interviews exploring candidates' judicial philosophy and approach to politically sensitive cases. They examined understanding of African contexts through questions about how continental history, diverse legal traditions, and contemporary challenges should inform African justice mechanisms. The selection process was intentionally rigorous and transparent to ensure that personnel staffing African accountability mechanisms possessed both technical competence and moral authority. We published selection criteria publicly so candidates and observers understood what qualities we prioritized. We disclosed committee membership so any concerns about conflicts of interest could be raised. We documented decision-making processes to demonstrate selections were merit-based rather than politically influenced. The transparency built confidence that African justice institutions would maintain high standards. We selected judges from across Africa's 54 nations representing diverse legal backgrounds including common law, civil law, Islamic law, and customary law traditions. The diversity ensured that African justice mechanisms reflected continental breadth rather than any single legal culture. Judges brought experience from national supreme courts, human rights tribunals, international legal practice, and academic scholarship. Several had previously served on ICC or other international courts and brought that expertise while sharing our commitment to addressing ICC failures through African alternatives. Prosecutors selected included veterans of complex domestic prosecutions, former military justice specialists who understood rules of engagement and war crimes, financial crime experts who could investigate corporate malfeasance, and human rights lawyers experienced in documenting atrocities. The diverse expertise meant African mechanisms could handle full range of cases, from battlefield crimes to corporate environmental destruction to systematic persecution. We built prosecutorial capacity matching any international institution. Investigators recruited included former police detectives skilled in gathering evidence and interviewing witnesses, forensic specialists who could analyze physical and digital evidence, military intelligence analysts who understood armed conflict contexts, and financial investigators who could trace money flows. The investigative teams possessed comprehensive skills needed to build strong cases regardless of crime complexity or perpetrator resources. Once selected, all personnel underwent extensive training that combined technical legal knowledge with practical skills and ethical grounding. The training program lasted 6 months and covered every aspect of investigating and prosecuting serious international crimes. We contracted leading experts from African universities, retired judges from various international courts who supported our initiative, human rights organizations with field experience, and specialized technical consultants. International humanitarian law training provided deep understanding of legal frameworks governing armed conflict and prohibitions on specific conduct. Participants studied Geneva Conventions, additional protocols, customary international humanitarian law, and African regional treaties. They examined case law from various tribunals to understand how legal standards had been interpreted and applied. They analyzed how humanitarian law should apply to contemporary conflicts, including counterinsurgency operations, drone warfare, and mercenary activities. The training ensured African justice personnel possessed expertise matching any international prosecutor or judge. Investigative techniques training covered evidence collection, witness interviewing, crime scene examination, and case building. Participants practiced gathering testimonial evidence through simulations where they interviewed actors playing traumatized witnesses. They learned forensic methods for documenting crime scenes, analyzing ballistic evidence, and examining satellite imagery. They studied how to build prosecutorial cases that would withstand defense challenges by connecting individual evidence pieces into comprehensive narratives, proving crimes beyond reasonable doubt. Witness protection training addressed how to keep witnesses safe despite threats from powerful actors who would prefer their testimony never reached court. Participants learned protocols for assessing witness vulnerability, relocating threatened individuals and families, providing security during court appearances, and maintaining confidential witness identities when necessary. They studied successes and failures of witness protection in various contexts to understand what approaches worked and which created new dangers. Victim support training emphasized that justice required centering victim needs rather than treating survivors merely as evidence sources. Participants learned trauma-informed interviewing techniques that obtained necessary information without re-traumatizing witnesses. They studied how to connect victims with medical care, psychological counseling, legal representation, and economic assistance. They examined restorative justice approaches that prioritized victim healing alongside perpetrator accountability. The training reflected African commitment to comprehensive justice serving survivors. Beyond technical skills, training emphasized ethical foundations that would guide African justice mechanisms. Participants studied judicial independence principles and how to resist political pressure on cases. They examined impartiality requirements and how to prevent personal biases from influencing professional judgments. They discussed integrity standards and why corruption would destroy institutional legitimacy. They explored how African justice traditions emphasizing community and reconciliation could complement but not compromise accountability for serious crimes. We also created witness protection programs that would enable individuals to testify about crimes by powerful actors without fearing retaliation that had silenced so many potential witnesses in the past. Many potential witnesses to foreign crimes in Africa had remained silent because they knew that speaking out could result in assassination, violent persecution, or economic destruction of their families by actors with vast resources and few scruples. Robust witness protection was absolutely essential for ensuring that evidence of crimes by foreign militaries and corporations could actually be presented in court rather than remaining hidden through intimidation. The witness protection programs we established operated through dedicated units within African justice institutions with specialized personnel, secure facilities, and substantial budgets. Protection officers assessed threats to potential witnesses through detailed evaluation of who might retaliate, their capabilities, and how they might act. Based on threat assessments, protection ranged from enhanced security at existing residences to full relocation with new identities for witnesses and their entire families. For witnesses facing moderate threats, protection involves secure transportation to court, armed guards during testimony, confidential scheduling, and post-testimony security monitoring. For witnesses facing severe threats from powerful actors, protection required relocating entire families to different countries, providing new identification documents, offering job placement assistance, covering living expenses during transition and maintaining long-term security monitoring. The comprehensive protection convinced witnesses that testifying wouldn't result in their deaths or their families' destruction. We built secure facilities where protected witnesses could live while cases proceeded. The facilities included housing for multiple families, schools for children, medical clinics, recreational areas, and security perimeters preventing unauthorized access. Families could live relatively normally while remaining completely safe from retaliation. The facilities' locations were classified secrets known only to protection officers and essential security personnel. Not even prosecutors handling cases knew where protected witnesses lived between court appearances. We allocated substantial budgets for witness protection, recognizing this was investment in justice rather than optional expense. Annual witness protection funding exceeded $50 million across African accountability mechanisms. The resources enabled protection for hundreds of witnesses simultaneously and demonstrated commitment to ensuring that fear would no longer prevent truth from reaching courts. Witnesses who had remained silent for years because they knew speaking out meant death now came forward because robust protection made testimony survivable. Victim support services provided medical care, psychological counseling, legal representation, and economic assistance to individuals harmed by crimes under investigation. African justice wasn't just about punishing perpetrators, but about healing victims and communities devastated by violence. The support services reflected this comprehensive approach to accountability that centered victim needs rather than only pursuing convictions against criminals. Medical care for victims addressed physical injuries from violence that often went untreated because victims lacked resources. Support services connected victims with hospitals, paid treatment costs, provided transportation to medical facilities, and arranged follow-up care. For victims of torture or sexual violence, specialized medical providers offered trauma-informed treatment respecting survivors' dignity while addressing health consequences. Psychological counseling helped victims process trauma from crimes they survived and losses they suffered. Trained counselors provided individual therapy, group support sessions, and community healing programs. Counseling addressed post-traumatic stress, depression, anxiety, and other mental health impacts of violence. Services were culturally appropriate, available in local languages, and incorporated African healing traditions alongside clinical psychological approaches. Legal representation ensured victims understood proceedings, could participate meaningfully in cases, and received compensation when appropriate. Victim lawyers explained legal processes, helped victims provide testimony effectively, advocated for victim interests during trials, and pursued reparations. Many victims had never interacted with legal systems and needed guidance to navigate complex proceedings. Lawyers empowered victims to engage with justice processes rather than being passive subjects. Economic assistance addressed material losses from crimes, including destroyed property, lost income, medical expenses, and funeral costs. Support services provided direct financial assistance, job training, small business loans, and connections to economic opportunities. Many victims were impoverished by crimes that destroyed their livelihoods. Economic assistance enabled rebuilding lives rather than remaining trapped in poverty resulting from victimization. We established the first case that African regional accountability mechanisms would investigate to send absolutely clear signal about our seriousness and jurisdiction to everyone watching. We selected a situation involving a French military operation in Mali that had killed 47 civilians, including 19 children, during an airstrike on a village in 2025. French authorities claimed they were targeting armed group fighters based on intelligence indicating enemy presence, but extensive investigation by human rights organizations had documented that the village had no armed group presence whatsoever and that the strike hit a wedding celebration where families had gathered for a joyous occasion. France refused to conduct meaningful investigation or acknowledge civilian deaths, claiming the operation was successful military action that had eliminated threats. The case was perfect for demonstrating African accountability mechanisms' purpose and capacity. The crimes were serious war crimes causing enormous suffering to dozens of families. The perpetrator was a powerful Western military that had never faced accountability for African civilian deaths. The evidence was extensive and compelling, making conviction likely. The political sensitivity would test whether African institutions could actually hold powerful foreign actors accountable despite pressure. Success would establish a powerful precedent that African justice was real rather than symbolic. We assigned a team of experienced prosecutors and investigators to build the strongest possible case. They traveled to the village to document the crime scene even though time had passed since the strike. They interviewed dozens of survivors and witnesses who described the wedding celebration and the sudden destruction when French aircraft appeared and dropped bombs. They gathered medical records documenting injuries and death certificates for victims. They collected fragments of munitions used in the strike and had them analyzed by weapons experts who confirmed they were French ordnance. They obtained satellite imagery showing the village before and after the attack with no evidence of military infrastructure or armed group presence. The investigative team also sought French military records that would reveal targeting decisions, intelligence assessments, rules of engagement, and post-strike analysis. They submitted formal requests to French authorities demanding full disclosure of operational details. They explained that African courts exercising legitimate jurisdiction over crimes in African territory required cooperation from all parties, including foreign militaries. They emphasized that transparency would serve justice and that obstruction would itself constitute additional violation. France's response to investigation requests was dismissive and contemptuous. French Defense Ministry rejected African court jurisdiction over French military operations conducted under international counter-terrorism mandates. They refused to provide any operational records or allow personnel to testify. They claimed military operations were confidential and that foreign courts had no right to examine French targeting decisions. They suggested African investigation was politically motivated harassment rather than legitimate justice process. The French refusal to cooperate confirmed what we had known. Powerful actors would resist accountability, and African mechanisms would need to proceed without cooperation when perpetrators obstructed justice. We continued building the case using available evidence which was already overwhelming. Survivor testimony would establish that the strike hit a wedding celebration with no military target present. Satellite imagery would corroborate the absence of armed group presence. Weapons analysis would prove French munitions were used. Expert testimony would explain how the operation violated international humanitarian law prohibitions on targeting civilians and requirements for distinguishing military from civilian objectives. We prepared detailed indictments against the French officers who had authorized and conducted the airstrike. The indictments charged war crimes through reckless or deliberate targeting of civilians and failure to take necessary precautions to minimize civilian harm. We named the French colonel commanding the operation, the fighter pilots who had released the weapons, and the intelligence officers who had provided faulty targeting information. We specified how each individual's actions contributed to crimes and legal standards their conduct violated. We issued international arrest warrants for the accused individuals, requesting that African countries detain them if they traveled to our continent. The warrants meant French military personnel involved in killing 47 Malian civilians could never safely visit Africa without risking arrest and prosecution. The restrictions on their movement were minimal accountability but better than the complete impunity they had previously enjoyed. The West African Justice Tribunal opened formal investigation into this incident, issuing notices to French military officials who had authorized and conducted the operation. We demanded that France provide operational details, including targeting intelligence, rules of engagement, and post-strike assessment. We subpoenaed testimony from French pilots and commanders involved in the operation. We made absolutely clear that we would investigate this crime thoroughly, regardless of French objections, and that we expected full cooperation. France's response was predictably dismissive and hostile. French officials claimed African courts had no jurisdiction over French military operations conducted as part of international counter-terrorism efforts. They refused to provide any information or allow personnel to testify. They characterized our investigation as politically motivated attempt to undermine French security cooperation in Africa. They threatened consequences for African countries that proceeded with investigating French forces. But we had anticipated this response and were prepared to proceed without French cooperation. We gathered extensive evidence through victim testimonies, satellite imagery analysis, communications intercepts, and expert technical assessments. We documented precisely what had occurred during the French airstrike, including the targeting process, the weapons used, the civilian casualties, and the absence of any legitimate military target. We built a comprehensive case that proved French forces had committed war crimes under any reasonable interpretation of international law. We issued arrest warrants for the French commander who had authorized the strike and the pilots who had carried it out. The warrants specified charges of war crimes through deliberate or recklessly negligent targeting of civilians. We requested that African countries detain these individuals if they traveled to African territory. We made clear that we would pursue prosecution regardless of how long it took, and that the suspects would never be safe traveling to Africa. France reacted with fury to African courts issuing arrest warrants for French military personnel. French officials condemned the action as outrageous overreach by courts lacking legitimate jurisdiction. They declared French military forces were immune from prosecution by foreign courts. They vowed to protect French personnel from what they characterized as politically motivated persecution. They mobilized diplomatic pressure on African countries to disavow the arrest warrants. But France's anger only validated our decision to create African accountability mechanisms outside Western control. French outrage at the possibility of facing justice for killing African civilians revealed their assumption that they should remain immune from accountability for their crimes in Africa. That assumption was precisely what we were challenging through African courts that would apply equal standards to all perpetrators regardless of nationality or power. The case proceeded through investigation and preparation for trial, even without French cooperation. We gathered overwhelming evidence documenting the crimes. We provided platform for victims to share their experiences and losses. We demonstrated that African justice institutions could conduct rigorous professional prosecutions, meeting highest legal standards. We proved that accountability for foreign crimes in Africa was possible through mechanisms we controlled. We announced that trials would be conducted in absentia if French suspects refused to appear voluntarily or be extradited. While this meant we couldn't imprison convicted individuals immediately, it would establish legal record of their crimes and ensure they could never travel to Africa without risking arrest. The moral and political impact of convictions would be significant even without physical custody of perpetrators. The trial of French military personnel for war crimes in Mali captured international attention throughout 2027. African courts were prosecuting Western soldiers for crimes in Africa for the first time in history. The proceedings were broadcast publicly so people worldwide could see evidence of French crimes and witness African justice in action. Victims testified about the horror of the airstrike that had killed their family members during a wedding celebration. Expert witnesses explained how the French targeting was criminally negligent at minimum. The prosecution presented overwhelming evidence of war crimes. France continued refusing to participate, which meant the defense was limited to what African public defenders could argue without cooperation from the accused. The trial proceeded methodically through all evidence and testimony. After 6 weeks, the court delivered verdicts, finding the French commander and pilots guilty of war crimes for the reckless airstrike that had killed 47 civilians. The court imposed maximum sentences allowed under African law and ordered France to pay substantial reparations to victims. France immediately rejected the verdicts as illegitimate and refused to pay any reparations. French officials claimed African courts had no authority to judge French military operations. They characterized the entire process as political theater rather than genuine justice. They vowed that France would never cooperate with African attempts to prosecute French personnel. But the international impact of the convictions extended far beyond France's refusal to accept them. The trial had documented French war crimes thoroughly through credible legal proceedings that met international standards. Human rights organizations praised the prosecution as an important step toward accountability for Western military actions in Africa. Legal scholars noted the precedent of African courts exercising jurisdiction over foreign perpetrators. Media coverage brought global attention to civilian casualties from French operations that had previously been ignored. Most importantly, African populations saw their institutions holding powerful foreign actors accountable for crimes in ways international institutions had never done. The trial demonstrated that African sovereignty included the right to investigate and prosecute anyone who committed crimes on our soil. We weren't dependent on Western-controlled courts that would never act. We had built our own mechanisms that would provide justice regardless of perpetrator identity or power. We opened additional investigations into crimes by other foreign actors in Africa using the precedent established by the French case. We investigated American drone strikes in Somalia that had killed civilians. We examined British security companies that had committed abuses in various African countries. We pursued cases against multinational mining corporations that had poisoned water supplies and destroyed communities. African accountability mechanisms became active and comprehensive. The development of robust African justice and accountability systems took years of sustained effort and substantial resources that we committed despite competing priorities. But by 2028, substantial progress was undeniable even to skeptics who had predicted our mechanisms would fail or remain symbolic without meaningful impact. African courts were handling cases involving serious crimes in multiple countries with professional competence and legitimate authority. Truth and reconciliation processes were addressing conflicts and healing communities through restorative approaches that honored African traditions. Regional mechanisms were investigating foreign actors whose crimes had previously gone completely unpunished because international institutions refused to act. The alternative systems we built were functioning effectively and providing accountability more meaningful than the ICC ever had for African victims. The African Justice Tribunal had opened 23 investigations into situations across West Africa, including crimes by foreign militaries, multinational corporations, and domestic actors. 12 cases had proceeded to trial with convictions achieved in 9 cases. The convicted included not only African perpetrators, but also foreign military personnel, corporate executives, and mercenaries. The tribunal was demonstrating that African justice applied equally to all criminals regardless of their power or connections. The African Regional Criminal Court had handled 7 complex cases involving multiple countries or particularly serious crimes requiring continental-level investigation and prosecution. The cases addressed situations ranging from cross-border violence to environmental destruction by multinational corporations to systematic human rights violations by armed groups. The court had established jurisprudence interpreting African legal standards in ways that advanced accountability while respecting due process. National courts, strengthened through African Union capacity building programs, had dramatically increased their ability to handle serious criminal cases professionally. Hundreds of judges and prosecutors had received specialized training. Courts had adopted modern case management systems. Witness protection programs enabled testimony about crimes by powerful actors. The improvements in national judicial capacity meant that most cases could be handled domestically without requiring regional or continental institutions. Truth and reconciliation processes had been established in 5 African countries, addressing conflicts and historical injustices through restorative approaches. These mechanisms heard testimony from thousands of victims and perpetrators. They documented patterns of violence and identified institutional failures that had enabled crimes. They made recommendations for reforms that would prevent future violations. They facilitated community healing through acknowledgement of harms and commitments to reconciliation. The processes demonstrated African justice traditions that emphasized restoration over purely punitive approaches. The impact on victims was profound and meaningful in ways the ICC had never achieved, despite its claims of serving victim interests. African justice mechanisms centered victim needs through comprehensive support services, opportunities for testimony that was heard and valued, and reparations that provided material assistance. Victims reported feeling that African processes actually acknowledged their suffering and sought to address it, rather than treating them as abstract legal categories useful only for achieving convictions. The international legal community gradually recognized African accountability mechanisms as legitimate alternatives to the ICC for crimes committed in Africa. Several European countries that had initially dismissed African courts as incompetent or biased acknowledged that our mechanisms met international standards for fair trials and due process. Academic journals published articles analyzing African jurisprudence on war crimes and crimes against humanity. International criminal law textbooks included sections on African regional accountability institutions as important developments in global justice systems. The success of African mechanisms also inspired similar initiatives in other regions that had experienced ICC bias or ineffectiveness. Latin American countries discussed creating regional courts that would have jurisdiction over crimes in their territories, including actions by foreign actors that international institutions ignored. Asian civil society organizations advocated for Asian accountability mechanisms that would apply regional legal traditions rather than Western-dominated international law. African example demonstrated that alternatives to failed international institutions were possible and could be effective. I am the architect of African withdrawal from the International Criminal Court that liberated 3 West African nations from a system of selective justice that prosecuted Africans while systematically protecting Western criminals from any accountability. I exposed the undeniable statistical reality that the ICC overwhelmingly targeted African situations, despite extensive evidence of Western crimes that the court refused to investigate. I coordinated simultaneous withdrawal by multiple countries that sparked continental reconsideration of ICC membership across Africa's 54 nations. I built alternative African accountability mechanisms that would provide genuine justice rather than political prosecution serving Western interests. I demonstrated conclusively that African sovereignty required rejecting international institutions that systematically disadvantaged our continent while claiming to serve universal principles. But I also recognized that building African accountability mechanisms required contributions from thousands of people beyond my individual actions. Judges who presided over difficult cases with integrity and competence made African justice credible. Prosecutors who investigated crimes meticulously despite political pressure ensured that convictions were based on evidence rather than politics. Defense attorneys who represented accused vigorously protected due process rights. Court administrators who managed complex cases professionally enabled efficient proceedings. Victim advocates who supported survivors with compassion served justice in its fullest sense. The success of African justice mechanisms reflected collective African commitment to accountability, rule of law, and sovereignty. We rejected external institutions that had failed us and built alternatives that served our needs and values. We demonstrated that African countries possessed the capacity, resources, and determination to create legitimate justice systems outside Western control. We proved that sovereignty meant more than nominal independence. It required actual control over institutions that would govern our territories and hold all actors accountable. Your legacy, ICC, is loss of jurisdiction over multiple African countries and a legitimacy crisis that threatens your institutional survival. My legacy is African sovereignty strengthened through rejection of biased international justice and creation of continental alternatives that serve African interests through mechanisms we control. But your legacy is also the demonstration that international institutions claiming universal jurisdiction actually serve particular power interests rather than genuine justice principles. You prosecuted the weak while protecting the powerful. You applied law selectively based on politics rather than evidence. You undermined your own legitimacy through systematic bias that African countries finally rejected after decades of accepting your authority. My legacy is also the proof that building alternatives to failed international institutions is possible when countries commit resources and coordinate action. We didn't just criticize the ICC. We created functional replacements that provide accountability more effectively. We didn't just reject external control. We built African institutions that serve our needs. We didn't just assert sovereignty rhetorically. We exercised it practically through withdrawal and institution building. History will remember clearly which of us served genuine justice and which served power disguised as law. The answer is written permanently in coordinated withdrawal across West Africa in 2025. Documented statistics proving systematic bias against Africa while protecting Western criminals. Alternative mechanisms built through African institutions that provide real accountability and continental reconsideration of ICC membership sparked by our action. You prosecuted Africans exclusively while ignoring Western crimes systematically. Africa withdrew our consent to your jurisdiction through formal legal process. The lesson is eternal. The proof is in successful withdrawal despite intense pressure to remain. The outcome is African countries judging ourselves through institutions we control rather than submitting to courts that serve external political agendas regardless of their claims to neutrality. Your authority over us ended permanently. Our sovereignty was recovered practically. We judge ourselves now through African mechanisms. We hold all actors accountable equally. We center victim needs genuinely. We apply justice without bias. We serve African interests directly. We control our institutions completely. The transformation from ICC subjugation to African sovereignty in justice and accountability represents one of the most significant achievements of our generation. For decades, African countries had accepted that serious crimes in Africa would be investigated and prosecuted by external institutions claiming universal jurisdiction. We assumed that African judicial systems were inadequate for handling complex international cases. We believed that legitimate justice required Western institutional frameworks and procedures. But the ICC's systematic bias and refusal to hold Western actors accountable for documented crimes revealed that external institutions didn't serve universal justice, but particular interests. African acceptance of ICC authority meant accepting that only Africans would face accountability while Western crimes went unpunished. This wasn't justice but subordination through legal mechanisms. Our withdrawal from the ICC and creation of African accountability mechanisms broke this pattern of subordination. We rejected external authority that didn't serve our interests. We built institutions that would hold all actors accountable equally. We demonstrated that African sovereignty included the right to administer justice on our own territories without external control. We proved that African judicial capacity matched or exceeded what international institutions provided. The success of African justice mechanisms 3 years after ICC withdrawal confirmed that our decision was correct and that alternatives we built were effective. African courts conducted fair trials meeting international standards. African prosecutors investigated crimes thoroughly with professional competence. African judges rendered decisions based on evidence and law rather than political considerations. African institutions provided accountability that the ICC had promised but never delivered for African victims. By 2028, African justice mechanisms had become established features of continental governance that would endure beyond current leadership. The institutions had legal frameworks, trained personnel, operational procedures, and political backing that ensured sustainability. Future African leaders would inherit functional justice systems that provided accountability without dependence on external institutions. The transformation we initiated would shape African sovereignty for generations. The lesson for Africa and the world was clear and undeniable. International institutions that serve power rather than justice deserve rejection, not deference. When institutions claiming universal principles apply them selectively based on politics, they lose legitimacy. When alternatives that serve actual needs can be built, dependence on failed institutions is unnecessary. When countries coordinate action and commit resources, they can exit bad systems and create better ones. African withdrawal from the ICC and creation of robust continental accountability mechanisms proved that sovereignty requires practical exercise rather than nominal assertion. We didn't just declare independence from biased international courts, we built African institutions that would provide genuine justice. We didn't just criticize selective prosecution, we created mechanisms that applied equal standards to all perpetrators. We didn't just assert rights rhetorically, we exercised them through concrete actions that transformed African relationship with international institutions fundamentally. The transformation represented decades of work compressed into 3 years of intensive institution building from 2025 through 2028. We mobilized billions of dollars in African resources to fund courts, train personnel, build secure facilities, and operate comprehensive justice systems. We recruited thousands of legal professionals who brought their expertise to continental service. We developed legal frameworks combining international standards with African traditions and contexts. We established operational procedures ensuring fairness, transparency, and effectiveness. We created systems that functioned reliably rather than remaining symbolic gestures. The practical exercise of sovereignty through functioning institutions distinguished our approach from countless previous African declarations of independence that changed little materially. For decades, African countries had proclaimed sovereignty while accepting that major decisions about our affairs would be made by external institutions controlled by foreign powers. We claimed independence while submitting to international courts that prosecuted only Africans. We asserted rights while allowing multinational corporations to exploit our resources without accountability. The gap between rhetorical sovereignty and practical subordination had been enormous. African withdrawal from the ICC and creation of continental accountability mechanisms closed this gap by exercising sovereignty practically through institutions we controlled. When French military killed Malian civilians, African courts investigated and prosecuted rather than depending on ICC mechanisms that would never act. When multinational corporations poisoned African water supplies, African tribunals held them accountable rather than accepting impunity. When cross-border crimes required investigation, African regional mechanisms provided justice rather than waiting for external institutions. We demonstrated that sovereignty meant actual control over justice and accountability in African territories.